Let's talk today about slipping versus knitting, the first stitch of every row. Let's just go over the basics. Slipping is if I take this stitch, having just knitted this direction along the row, and I go to turn back and knit the other direction, and I do nothing whatsoever with the end peg. So for the purposes of loom knitting, I just slipped that stitch, and now I'm knitting all the others. My personal style is to wrap the whole row and then knit them over. Last stitch first. That way that last stitch holds my wraps on. That does not really matter to what we're doing. I'm simply explaining what you're seeing me doing. Now, I slipped on this edge, and I've been slipping this whole swatch on my right hand edge. But now I'll show you what happens if we knit the edge. What's the difference? I do wrap that first stitch. Now, when I turn it, you'll see if I pulled very hard, I'd be pulling last row's stitch around. But it's not difficult not to pull hard and to be able to knit it over. And now I will wrap and knit the remainder of this row. All wrapped. Take note of something. When people say, or hear me say, just ignore that first stitch, they get worried. If I ignore it, it will never grow, the fabric on that side, and that just can't work. And you would be right if that were true. But I'm only ignoring it going the other direction. This direction I wrapped and knitted every stitch, and you just saw me knit that one off. So next row when I slip it, it hasn't been ignored for very long. And the resulting edge, some people find to have a neater look. This is what we're getting on the slipped edge. This is what we're getting on the knitted every row edge. So you may wonder, well, if slipping looks neater, why don't we always slip? And the main reason you would not always slip, I am slipping this time again on the right hand edge, is that if you are going to seam an edge to something, you get a nicer seam if every row has been knitted. And the fact that the edge might be a little bit less attractive goes away because the edge is consumed in the seam. So again, I'll knit over this row, having slipped the very first stitch. Now you have an option when knitting the first stitch. One on the kiss loom is pretty easy. It's what I just showed you. Just wrap that peg and be careful. But you may have heard of something called a half hitch. Some people call it a half stitch. And that is an actual knotting term. If I made for ropes and things like tying up animals at hitching posts. If I take this yarn, put it between my fingers and twist it, I have made a half hitch. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Can you see that for some people that might be easier to knit over than when we wrapped like this? It's a little bit less complicated, and it's a more definite stitch than the wrap. On a kiss loom, the difference is minor. On some styles of loom, it's a bigger deal. Let's make one more important point. You've seen this, but I'm going to draw your attention to it. There is no occasion on a kiss loom when you wrap the end pin. We wrap each peg and we go behind each pin that has pegs to either side of it. But we do not wrap the end pins. Doing so would cause a problem. So whether slipping or knitting, you would never do this If I were to slip, having done that, you can see what would happen. These stitches would get knitted off and move on down. This one never would, because we don't knit from pins, so it would make the knitting wad up like this continually. On the other hand, if I knitted the first peg, it wouldn't have a beneficial effect either. So we'd get the same loop hanging the knitting up and refusing to let it drop down. I'm ready to knit from left to right. Let's practice that half hitch again. Pinch, twist, turn. I'm pretty sure that either direction that you pinch, twist, and turn counts as a half hitch, but they will produce slightly different effects because of the direction of turn, and you can choose the one you want. While I knit for a little bit, let's review. You slip the beginning stitch of a row if you are concerned about the neat look of the edge. If it's going to show, that's often a choice. You almost never slip it if you are planning to seam that edge to another piece of knitting. The choice about whether to use just a normal wrap and knit over the first stitch if you're knitting it, or a half hitch, is based on what you find convenient and the look that you like the best. They produce similar results, though not identical. Either one counts as knitting the first stitch. I would recommend very strongly that you be consistent throughout any single project. Although it's a good idea to do what I'm doing here, a swatch that has no other reason for being than practice, so that you can compare the effects and decide what's going to work best for you in any individual case. Let's look at our swatch. This is the end on which, or the edge on which I slipped. We have a continuous look of one chain stitch going up near the edge. It's actually rolling under from the other side. And there are half as many links in the chain as there are rows in the fabric from skipping every other row. Every time I knitted this way, I did knit those stitches, so that's where we get some rows, but every time I went back the other way, I slipped them. It does look nice. I've heard people say you can do this to limit or prevent rolled edges on knitting, and I don't really agree. You can see there is an effect. It's not rolling too much, but it is still rolling. So I don't agree that that's the whole solution for rolled edges. However, it does make a nice looking edge. Here's the other edge, knitted every row, end of one row, then again for the beginning of the next. And here is where I switched to the half hitch rather than just wrapping. The wrapping on this loom is a little bit tighter than working the half hitch. You can sort of see why that would be. You could see the yarn tightening up from the previous row. So you might choose on that basis which one you wanted to do. So that's it. To knit or to slip? That's the question.